evening from Bhutan, and at the very outset, I would like to thank Julia and Aftab for giving me this beautiful platform to share some of my insights, some of my experiences, research experiences associated with the notion of post-colonialism and how this post aspect in the perspective of post-colonialism is so problematic in the contemporary times, especially with respect to the current socio-political and the cultural situation in India. And my talk will basically center around my current area of research, that is with a community, with an interracial community referred to as the Anglo-Indians of Bow Barracks. This place called Bow Barracks is geographically located in the central part of the city called Calcutta in India. But if we look at their current socio-cultural and political scenario, they are being very much racialized and ghettoized from time to time. So how this situation has erupted, so on what basis? So we will be looking into the various issues that came up during the colonial times and how it has continued in the post-colonial times. And at the same time, we will also talk about, we are also going to talk about one important perspective, that is how they have been colonially toxified from time to time, historically, socially, and culturally. And it will also enable us to see that at present times, how they are trying to detoxify the various colonial burdens that they have been bearing from the colonial times since their origin. Uh, Another important aspect of my talk is this notion of in-betweenness, which is usually not seen in a very bright sense, this concept of in-betweenness, but how they are actually converting this negative element into a positive aspect of existence. So coming to my first part of my talk, so especially what happened after the emergence of post-colonial India, what we see is the physical colonial empire obviously receded, but what happened is a metaphysical colonial empire that came to the forefront. And what I mean by this metaphysical empire is that how this various ethics and norms of colonization and colonial attitudes gets reflected through our regular habits, customs, practices, behavioral patterns, food patterns, so on and so forth. Now, as a result, because of this arrival, because of this reflection of this colonial toxicated elements within our attitudes, within our regular practices, as a result, what happens, it led to the wide range of social, cultural, and political subjugation across the nation. Now, coming specifically towards the kind of socio-cultural crisis that was created, that was actually systematically developed in post-colonial India, and it continues from the colonial times, actually led to the subjugation of several communities, several societies. And one such community was the Anglo-Indians of Bow Barracks, on whom I am currently working. So keeping this aspect at the background, I would like to address a few questions, a few aspects which I have outlined in the slide. So the 4 questions basically which I'm looking forward to address is, like, since when the Anglo-Indian community in Kolkata has been facing this problem of racism, what are some of the major reasons that created such a kind of scenario? And these reasons actually can be traced from the colonial times till the post-colonial times. So keeping these reasons at the background, how they are racialized in the contemporary era, and obviously how do the current residents make efforts to colonially detoxify their identity and celebrate their in-betweenness. So in order to trace the historical origin of this community, we need to analyze 2 perspectives or 2 intentions of their origin. So one is obviously the personal intention, why the Europeans, when they came in India, why do they really wanted the establishment and the development of this Anglo-Indian community at all, and what was their colonial intention, which is very much related to this aspect of personal intention. So what happened is in May 1498, if we look into the first evolution of the Anglo-Indian community in India, it was back at the time of Vasco da Gama when he arrived in the coast of Calicut in Kerala, in the modern state of Kerala, in the year 1498. He came along with his fellow navigators, and when he came along with his fellow navigators, what happened is they could not bring their family because of a lot of geographical complications and several other social reasons. And obviously, when they came here for the sake of their entertainment, for the sake of companionship, they sought the hands of the local people, the local women especially. So these companionship often got converted into marriages, or even outside the marriages, the relationships born them children. And thus the first group of Anglo-Indian community can be traced back to this time of 15th century or the middle part of the 16th, when we find the offspring of Portuguese fathers and Indian mothers, and who were basically referred to as the Luso-Indians, and broadly they were regarded as the first group of Anglo-Indians in India. And then later on, we find with the arrival of the Dutch, the British, most importantly, the British, when the Anglo-Indian community actually flourished really widely. So when the Anglo-Indian community came to the social, cultural, and the political prominence of colonial India, it was mainly at the time of the British. So when the Britishers arrived, prior to the concept of divide and rule, the Britishers actually looked forward to create the notion of define and rule. So in order to create a kind of system, a kind of structure which will be convincing for the natives. And obviously their intention was to look ahead with the natives who are well educated, who belong to the upper class and the upper caste. So obviously, so this notion of define and rule, this one perspective of the colonial intention behind the development of this Anglo-Indian community was this define and rule, so that they can create a community who will be very close to their skin color, who can talk like, who can speak in their language, who actually follows their cultures, their traditions, their lifestyles, so that they can create an authentic structure in the authentic social, cultural, and political structure from within the nation, who can implement the rules, the regulations, and also the ethics and norms of the Britishers even after they leave India. So this was one major intention, the colonial intention. At the same time, we find that some very remarkable aspects, that during this time when basically the Anglo-Indians at the time of the British, they were never treated at par with the natives. They always had a higher level, higher socio-cultural status than the natives. And also the Anglo-Indians themselves felt proud of the matter that they are treated not at par with the natives, but somewhere treated higher than the natives. So but at the same time, it is important for us to note that they were never treated even at par with the British. So if we look at the hierarchy, it's of course the British, then the Anglo-Indians, then the other non-Anglo-Indian natives. And in fact, if we look into the colonial Kolkata in the city, what we find is there were very clearly developed geographical divisions. Like we had these gray areas, we had these white areas, and we had this brown areas. So gray areas were basically meant for the residencies of the Anglo-Indians. So even if we visit Kolkata right now, and if we look into some of the prominent Anglo-Indian residencies, they belong to the earlier gray area regions. So the notion of this racial divide, the notion of this racial fragmentation was already there at the time of the British era. So they existed in the middle, so higher than the natives but lower than the British people. Now, as a result, now with the passage of time, what happened, they were given respectable position in the army, they were allowed to mix with the other British people, they were allowed to exchange their cultures and traditions and so on and so forth. But with the passage of time, especially when it came to the time of 1786, this period of time is basically referred to as the turn of the fortune wheel for the for the Anglo-Indians. Now this is so because it came up with three orders. So on 14th March 1786, if we see that earlier, what happened, we find the upper orphanage schools in Anglo-Indian, the Anglo-Indian children who were part of this upper orphanage school, they were allowed to proceed for higher education in England and other parts of Europe, but it was actually stopped. The second order was passed in 19th April 1791, and this actually prevented the appointment of the Anglo-Indians in one of their, I mean, proud jobs, that was the civil, military, and the marine forces. And it was a matter of great pride for the Anglo-Indians to be a part of this job, and it was completely slashed. And the last nail was hammered in their coffin in 1795. The exact date is not available, so I've just mentioned the year 1795. And we find here that those Europeans, like people who are not of pure European descent, they were not allowed to be part in the, main combatant forces, but they can be a part of the non-combatant positions like the fifers, drummers, bandsmen, and farriers. Now, one very basic reason why this sudden change in the attitude of the colonizers towards the Anglo-Indians were because they were suffering from a kind of insecurity, especially after the San Domingo Revolution, when the mulattoes actually, revolted against the colonizers. This was a kind of warning that if this Anglo-Indian community surpasses the British in number, a point might come when they start overpowering the colonizers and they take their position. So obviously the British never wanted to do that. So this was that San Domingo Revolution played quite a important role to introduce this turn of the fortune wheel. So these three orders totally devastated the Anglo-Indian community, and the other side, the other option for them, that they can be at par with the natives, which on one side they never wanted to be. On the other side, they were afraid of the fact that they may not be accepted in the native community, because if we again look into some of the major historical movements in India, like the 1857 revolution, or sometime around the Quit India movement, it is the Anglo-Indian community always fought in favor of the British. So these were obviously some of the reasons what brought this Anglo-Indian community in such a devastated state. So this is briefly the historical background of how the Anglo-Indians have been racialized from the time of the British. Now, coming to the post-independence scenario in India, we find that after independence, there were reservations which were made for the Anglo-Indians for political reservations and jobs and everywhere. But like, for example, we have some examples like Article 333, representation in state assemblies, then Article 331, which actually the House of the Parliament. Then we see Article 336, we have some employment reservations and all. And Article 337, that is promises the grants for the Anglo-Indian schools. But the point is, if this were the rules and regulations which were on pen on paper, but what happened in reality is, which I will take all of you in the following slides when we look into the contemporary scenario of what is happening right now with them. But prior to that, we must also see that in spite of these reservations, why this present community has been victimized. Now, in order to understand the victimization of this present community, it is actually very crucial for us to remember that after India's independence, what happened is, now, obviously, the colonizers, which I was talking about, this physical and the metaphysical notion of colonization, that after India's independence, the government that was formed, we had several caste, communal, and cultural policies, but at the same time, the hierarchies were very clear. Certain castes, certain communities were given more priority than the others because they served the policies, they served the norms and conditions of the government. They functioned more or less to be apt, they functioned as puppets of the government, which the Anglo-Indians never wanted to do. So obviously there were this is one particular reason why they were actually racialized, they were actually removed from the socio-cultural mainframe. And this notion of pan-Indian development has always been very problematic, because if we look into the certain socio-cultural individual rights, they never were distributed equally among every citizens in the India in terms of their, irrespective of their caste, communal, or cultural belongingness. So obviously this pan-Indian development was more than help, it was actually a kind of violence. And the same thing goes for towards the notion of promoting certain ethnic cultures and traditions, because when they talk of promoting certain ethnic cultures and traditions, what happened is, in the process, It was only very much situated within certain geographical cultural boundaries, and lots of other geographical cultural and social boundaries were negated. And this is again one reason why the Anglo-Indians, specifically from the Bow barracks, were actually completely negated from the socio-cultural mainframe. So when we look into the racism in Bow barracks, now we talked about in the earlier points about the norms and conditions, that how the government has assured that they are going to have some grants for the Anglo-Indian schools. But the very first point, these are all part of my fieldwork practices, the fieldwork experiences actually, where there are like many schools in Kolkata. If we just go and talk to the people, the principals, the authorities, they say that they are forced to create a scenario where they can't kind of admit Anglo-Indian children there, because the parents from the other schools, the parents from the other houses, they kind of protest that the cultures, the traditions of the Anglo-Indians actually is ominous for their children. It's bad for their children. Their children might go into the wrong side because of the Anglo-Indian students, Anglo-Indian friends they are having. So mostly right now we see that most of the Anglo-Indian children in Kolkata they are actually totally secluded in the Christian missionary schools, or very specific, to be very specific, Anglo-Indian Christian schools. So this is one reason that child might suffer from behavioral and cultural disintegration. A similar kind of scenario exists in the workplaces as well. What happens usually in the workplaces, we find, I mean, you can talk to the native non-Anglo-Indian people, they kind of give you reasons that they are not serious, they are not on time, etc. But it is that sense of insecurity, because Anglo-Indians has this natural flair of speaking good in English. So obviously this burden that they are carrying, that from the colonizers, that they are speaking in English, they have this Western lifestyles, they dress not like the Indians but more like the Westerners. So these burdens are now kind of playing a negative role in their life. These toxics of colonization are actually playing a negative role in their life. And one of those proud moments of the Anglo-Indian culture, those dance, music, sports, these right now in case of Bow barracks is very much situated and located in order to fight poverty. So these, which were actually their major cultural identifiers, right now they survive as kind of poor or jobs just to fill up their stomach, just to earn some money to help out their family members and fellow others. And if you look into the contribution of the local municipal authorities towards looking after their buildings, towards the sewerage systems and towards others, they are being actually quite deliberately, they have this very unusual attitude of negating them when everything around the other communities, when all forms of developments and advancements are taking place. But when it comes in funding for the Anglo-Indian community, they are absolutely reluctant about it. Moreover, political goons and several other political pressures come up to rip apart this Anglo-Indian community, to break away those heritage buildings, which actually belongs to at least 114 years old. Like they are old at the time of the First World War, when the American troops came there, settled there. Later on, they moved out, and then they handed over these buildings to the Anglo-Indians of Bow barracks. And it's like more than a century-old buildings, and these buildings are right now often threat comes to remove these kind of buildings, to break those, and to create modern structures out there. So some of these crises which they are facing at this moment, these are quite equivalent to racialism. And one particular reason is just because they are Anglo-Indians. They are neither regarded as Anglos nor regarded as Indians. And these in-betweenness has been a very problematic affair for these Anglo-Indians of Bow barracks. So how they are at present, like as a community, how they are trying to detoxify themselves, that how they're trying to show that notion of Anglo-Indian, that they are superior than the natives, is gradually changing, is gradually transforming, and efforts are being made by the current residents of Bow barracks. So first is the dismantling residential hierarchy. So there was a time when Bow barracks used to be exclusively the residential area of the Anglo-Indians, and no outsiders were allowed. But right now we find that different communal and different religious groups are residing there. We find people from different communities, different religious backgrounds, they are coming together, celebrating their festivals. We find a lot of Chinese, lot of Tibetans are also settling up in this area of Bow Barracks. And if we go from visit this place from different point of time in the year, that we find this place celebrates all kinds of festivals in equal manner. But earlier there was a time only, obviously it was because of the Christian residency. So except Christmas and any other rituals associated with Christianity, no other festivals were celebrated. But in the contemporary times, we find this, that celebration of Eid and Chinese New Year and some of the various other cultures and traditions and religious rituals are being regularly celebrated widely across the community. And another is the cultural practices. Now, cultural practices, dismantling, how it takes place. It takes place through, like, once a week. What happens? Often the community come together and they organize a kind of potluck party where people from different households bring their own cultural dishes, own cultural traditional items. Even it is a part of their street foods as well. And right now the dressing style is very interesting, which I will talk a bit more about in my next slide, in my next part. And we see that through fashion practices, through their dressing styles, through their food habits, right now everything is so mixed up and so exchangeable that no one can say that this Anglo-Indian community lives on a separate plane. They try to mix with the people. People are welcoming their warmth. People are coming up and mixing with them. The scenario is gradually changing right now. And obviously the linguistic hierarchies, I mean, it's no more like if you're going to speak with the Anglo-Indian people, they are not just speaking within English, they are fluent in the native Bengali language, they are fluent in Hindi, at the same time they're fluent in any other Indian languages. So they're trying to gradually, cleanse themselves of the colonial toxins that they were carrying within their cultures, within their practices, within their traditions. Over the last 100 years, they're trying to cleanse it from time to time. And how they're celebrating in-betweenness, just a small perspective, a small idea about this in-betweenness. So let us look into some aspects like this Anglo-Indian food practices. Like, for example, food. When we talk about these items like chicken jalfrezi, potole dorma, potole is a kind of goat, it's stuffed goat, then yellow rice, pepper water, these are all very mixed items. These items have developed through combining from the kitchen of the Bengali household, from the non-Bengali household, the Muslim household, the other cultural households. The cooks, they have all combined these food items using spices from West and as well as Indian spices and creating these kind of items. And these items are actually even very habitual, very regular in any other Indian household. But these are not, we can't classify these items as like very Bengali item or very Anglo-Indian item. These are very mixed item, mixed cultural items which have developed from intercultural interactions. For example, if we look into the dressing style of the Anglo-Indians, usually the standard dressing style of the Anglo-Indians have been, the long skirts and long tops. But with the passage of time, we find that this kurta, which is a very Indian traditional dressing item, mixed with pants or worn with pants, these are some of the, in fact, very prominent fashion trends which exist in Kolkata right now. And it is like any girls, any women middle-aged are going to follow this dressing style. And this is actually a very Anglo-Indian combination. So on one side this Western and one side this Indian combination. And another remarkable thing is about the language, the usage of words. For example, in Hindi, we have this term called jhapad. It means slapping. So from the jhapad comes the term jhap, which is often used by the Anglo-Indians to talk about slapping. For example, when we see baba, this is another very Hindi, very Indian, very Bengali culture. When we are discussing, we say, "Oh, baba, I can't do it." So this baba term also is a very part of the Anglo-Indian usage. They often use it while they are going along with their words. Then we see this element of called pakka. This, for example, this pakka, which means actually for sure. Then Almira. Now, Almira is a term which is usually believed to be of Portuguese origin, but at the same time, there are some confusions, there are some questions that it can be of the Persian origin as well. Now, this Almira is a very common term which are used in the Anglo-Indian households. Then this called this Missy Baba. This Missy Baba, we often say this Baba to small children like Baba, Babu, and so on and so forth in our native tongue. And they have connoted this Missy Baba to address the kids out of warmth and love. And there are so many examples, so many instances where the current scenario, where the current Anglo-Indian community is in Bow Barracks specifically, that they are trying, they're working hard in order to colonially detoxify themselves, at the same time in order to come up with a cultural discourse, come up with a cultural tradition, which actually enables them to be in communion with all the other communities, to lead a life like the rest. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sayan, for such a wonderful talk. It's really interesting. You covered so many things. So if we do not have a question so far, right away, I can go ahead and start with one, but I'll just wait for a second if somebody wants to ask anything.
Yeah, anyone, please feel free to ask. If you're shy, put it in the chat box. Or otherwise, just unmute yourself. Talk. Or after, maybe you want to go ahead for everyone.
Yeah. I agree.
Overcome their shyness.
Yeah. Sayan, please, can you please elaborate a bit more about you talked about the cultural heritage, you talked about the toxicity of coloniality. I was just wondering, how would you relate it to the present day scenario? It seems like this intermixing stopped, let's say, at partition, or even well before that. First of all, correct me, where did it stop? So when you say that these people are trying to come back and interact with the community and trying to get out of the toxicity of coloniality, isn't it the same for every other, let's say, every other Indian in that sense, in that respect? So my argument is that probably it's the same burden that they share with everybody else, or is there anything else added to it that is specific in nature?
Thanks, Aftab. That's an interesting question. Actually, the point is, if we look into the present residents, and if we interact with the present residents of Bow Barracks, usually it is seen that many of them have even forgotten about their cultural and historical heritage. They just know that they are Anglo-Indians. But this very name, this notion, this tagline, which was once a matter of pride for them, right now it is a kind of burden for them because of this very being Anglo-Indian. So for the rest of the Indians, it is this cultural burden. They have this cultural burden, linguistic burden they must have been carrying. But for these community, the extra burden is being referred to as being Anglo-Indian. So neither they are referred to as Anglos nor they are Indians. So I think there is a burden in their very existential identity, in their very name. So in that way, they are kind of, their scenario is different. And I will go to the extent of arguing that is worse than what the other Indians have to bear this burden. Obviously, for the people who have been refugees and so on and so forth, there have been so many burdens. But for being referred to as Anglo-Indians, this very in between liminal existence, that they are neither referred to as accepted in the Indian community, and they have been deserted by the Anglo community long time back. So I think this is a more of a critical as compared to the rest of the Indians.
Okay, thank you so much. But I still wonder, what is the giveaway? So what indicators of identity give it away? So they self-identify as Anglo-Indians, or people identify them as Anglo-Indians? Or let's say if I look at somebody from India, could I identify it? I mean, is there a pattern of a dress that you mentioned? Is it more Bengali because they're in part of Calcutta, or is it like every other Indian attire in that matter?
Actually, their identity of being an Anglo-Indian historically is a matter of pride. And currently, they're happy to call themselves as Anglo-Indians, for sure. But when the outsiders, a specific group of cultural outsiders, when they identify them as Anglo-Indians, their attitude towards their identification is very problematic actually. And this is why they wish to live as Anglo-Indians for sure. They wish to exist as Anglo-Indians for sure. They wish to live with their cultural identity, but at the same time, they're also quite conscious of the fact that the kind of colonial burden, the burdens which they are bearing, like for example, the most important was how they were treated ahead of the native community. So obviously this was a matter of pride for them once upon a time, but right now it is no more for them. It is actually a kind of burden for them. So obviously for them, being an Anglo-Indian is a matter of pride, but at the same time they're also conscious about the fact that the negative traces, the colonial traces that they're bearing with them right now. And coming to this question of dressing, this dressing is actually very difficult to categorize as very Bengali. Because if I'm doing it as very Bengali, then I'm kind of again compartmentalizing the community. So obviously this is a kind of dressing style which is quite prominent across India right now, the kind of dressing style they are wearing. But if we look into the bit of this history of this dressing style, like for example wearing this kurta along with long pants or kurta along with long skirts, it's a very interesting combination. Style dresses mostly introduced by the Europeans in India as long skirts along with the Indian style dresses, and the Anglo-Indians consciously practice this. They love to practice this in order to give a kind of information, a kind of message to the outside community, to others, that they are like, at present they are like any other Indian community. They might be Anglo-Indians, they might have been cultural differences, but it doesn't mean that they kind of generate or they believe in any kind of hierarchy which actually existed at the time of the colonizers.
Thank you so much. Varun, I guess you have a question. Please go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Don't know whether he just disappeared. Varun, if you want to go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? I can't hear the other side. Hello.
Yes, I can hear you, Varun.
Varun, you can go ahead and just talk. I don't know whether there's some technical issues there. I think we'll wait. He will probably join us again in a little while. So,
Julia, please, you can go ahead if you have anything in mind.
yeah, or anyone else who wants to go first with a question? Otherwise, Sayan, I was wondering, when you talked about in-betweenness and detoxification, whether it was not so much detoxification, but rather like, well, some form of hybridity with just one more category inserted, not just, you know, the colonizer and the colonized, but the in-betweeners also, but basically the same idea of cultural hybridity.
Actually, I would like to tell you why I analyze it as a kind of detoxification, because the point is, when for the Anglo-Indians, especially of this Bow Bags community, on one side, when the British obviously created this rank that they are higher than the natives, it was always a matter of cheer and celebration for them. On the other side, the British also ensured that they are not at par with the colonizers. So they create a kind of community which are like the colonizers, but they are not. So for the very first thing is this racial categorization. This racial difference was very much there at the time of the colonial era. So first the British, and then the Anglo-Indians, and then the natives. Now this, obviously, after independence, the Anglo-Indians had this expectation. The Anglo-Indians had this belief and expectation that when the British will leave, they will also take them along with them in their country, and kind of give them jobs and services or whatever kind of facilities which they actually enjoyed in India. But that obviously never happened. So this racial categorization was already existing. The natives were obviously very irritated. The natives obviously had a kind of negative feeling towards the Anglo-Indians, which actually augmented, which actually increased after the colonial era, because the British left. Their space for comfort was totally gone. So now the culture, the kind of traditions, the cultural practices, the behavioral practices which they have inherited from their colonial fathers or colonial people, were actually right now working as a kind of poison for them. It was a kind of problem for them right now, because it is because of these, the natives, obviously on one side the historical stories, as I shared about the Quit India movements and about all the other kinds of other anti-colonial struggles, where always the Anglo-Indians fought for the colonizers. So now, right now, the kind of cultural aspects, the cultural practices, in food, fashion, and everything that they were bearing, it was a kind of burden. It was a kind of poison for them, which with the passage of time, they realized that now these are the particular aspects which are being identified by the natives, in order to classify them, in order to racialize them, in order to push them away from the social mainframe. And you won't believe that when I, for the first time, went on to go ahead with the research, I was not very sure about the exact place where they reside. So when I asked one of them, I remember that they connoted the community as Kala Angrez. So Kala Angrez is a Hindi term. Kala means black and Angrez means English. So they are kind of identified as Kala Angrez. And it is because, not because rather than the skin color, this hatred terminology comes more than the skin color. It comes because of the practices of the anger that people still bear against them. So I think it is now, it is because of those cultures which were once a matter of pride for them, has become exist within them as right now as toxins that flows through their practices. This flows through their habitual aspects. So this is why in the last two slides, when I talked about that how they're trying to colonially detoxify themselves, I very specifically I use this term of detoxification. That is how they're trying to cleanse themselves of this burden, and trying to interact with the other cultural patterns, other cultural ideas, invite them to share their own ideas, and create a kind of communion, a mixed cultural element.
But Varun, Sayan, here lies the paradox. So, in answer to the previous question, you were mentioning that they identify themselves as still the bearer of that identity marker, but now you said that they are trying to detoxify. So how do you reconcile these two strands of argument? So one is that they want to detoxify and be like any other Indian, and the other is that they still identify themselves with their same old markers.
Well, see, Aftab, actually, what I mean when I say Anglo-Indians, this very identity of the Anglo-Indians is a mixed identity. So when we look into the attitude of the common people, if we look from the gaze of the common people, the way they look at the Anglo-Indians, how the non-Anglo-Indians look at the Anglo-Indians, they understand them, analyze them as at par or parallel with the British, that they were enjoying all the facilities of the British. So there are two dimensions clearly. So one is the identity of the Anglo-Indians in original, and the other is the gaze of the non-Anglo-Indians towards them. So when I say that when I say this Anglo-Indians, they are happy to be identified as Anglo-Indians. They wish to create an information, they wish to create a kind of discourse which shows them that they are a mixture of the Anglos and the Indian community. And they have those traditions of both the Indians and the Anglos as well. Now, there was a time when they were treated obviously ahead of the natives by the colonizers. Now the scenario has completely changed. The current residents tries to give a kind of information that they are not Anglos, but they are a part of India. They have the Indian cultural, Indian traditions, Indian aspects in them as well. So this is what the Anglo-Indians wish. Now the other side, for the second question, when I talked about that they wish to give this, when they try to mix their cultures, mix their traditions with the other Indian communities, they try to give this message to the non-Anglo-Indian community who actually bear this gaze towards them, because the non-Anglo-Indian community never looks at them as a mixture of the Indian and the Anglo community. They always look at them separately, and they think that they were once the, the workers for the British, so they should be treated as, with an anti-colonial gaze. So they should be treated as one who were also responsible for colonizing us. So there is a difference in the gaze of looking at the community. So one side, it is how the Anglo-Indians present themselves. On the other side, how the non-Anglo-Indian natives in Kolkata or widely in Bengal look at them. So this is why I talked about this Anglo-Indian thing from two dimensions.
Thank you. It was very clear. Thanks.
Thanks, Sayan. I think we've got Juan Fernando who wants to ask something.
Thank you very much, Sayan. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, Fernando, tell me.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. And myself, I just finished one semester in GNU in New Delhi, so this is really getting some ideas when I was living in India. But I wanted to do a specific question, because for me it's really interesting when you talk about Anglo-Indians in the relation of the space of this specific community. But what happened when they move outside this community, when they go to bigger cities, where, because specifically in the scenario of GNU, with many friends that came from Kolkata, there was never this talk about Anglo-Indians, of this identification of someone being called as Anglo-Indians, even that they come from different parts of Calcutta. So what about that specific aspect? What happened when they move outside this space where they are already identified and go to other spaces? And the second question is, why do you think that this specific category rise in this specific place and not in other spaces where the colonizers took place, specifically England colonizers? You don't see the same case in, for example, in Sri Lanka. You see the idea of divide and rule between Tamils and Sinhalese, but you don't see Anglo-Tamils or Anglo-Sinhalese. You don't see this relation, and don't say even in the case of South Africa, there's if you are white, you are white. If you are black, you are black. But there's not this line when you can call or create a new identity. So what do you think about that specific aspect? Thank you, Sayan.
Oh, thank you so much for this question. So coming to the first question of space, actually what happens is when we are talking about this notion of space, as we're talking about that, now if you look into the Anglo-Indian community, there are clearly two stratification within the Anglo-Indian community itself, especially if we look into the space of Kolkata. What happens is there is a clear group of rich Anglo-Indians. Now, if we look into Kolkata, we have this Anglo-Indian Association of Kolkata. We have widely the Anglo-Indian Association of India, where they actually come together, different Anglo-Indians from different parts of the country, different parts of the city together, celebrate festivals, organize potluck parties and dance parties to keep their cultures and traditions alive. But when we look into this Anglo-Indians of Bow Barracks, they are even segregated within the Anglo-Indian community also. So this Anglo-Indian of Bow Barracks, they are not accepted as Anglo-Indians for various reasons. Like when I spoke to other Anglo-Indian people living in different other parts of the city who are actually very flourishing and, to be very specific, very rich, they actually don't identify them because of their surnames, because most of their surnames don't cater to the Irish, the Scottish and the British, the first thing. And the second thing is, this community also, they believe, because of the difference in skin color, difference in their dressing style, and at the same time they are no more very much akin to the British cultures and traditions. So therefore they are trying to interact with more with the other communities in across the city. So obviously this is a major reason why this community of Bow Barracks obviously find it's such a kind of problem. Now, in most of the other parts of the city, you find there are a lot of Anglo-Indians who are staying, who are very flourishing, who are very advanced, and a massive number of Anglo-Indians, they have migrated across the globe. So Anglo-Indians altogether, if I say that Anglo-Indian as a community is struggling, it is wrong. So this is why my project always talk about my Anglo-Indian community of Bow Barracks. The specific mention of the name Bow Barracks is actually is very important to identify the Anglo-Indian community. Their problem not only lies between the cultural outsider and the insider, but also within inside the community, they have these hierarchies and conflicts. So the other Anglo-Indians don't look at them as Anglo-Indians, and they are never included as a part of their cultural celebrations, cultural festivals, or any other social works they actually include to help the other Anglo-Indians. So this goes with the answer for the space. And now comes with the identity. I think when they move out of their, like when we are talking about this Anglo-Indian identity, coming to my previous answer, or connected to my previous answer, it's actually very diverse at present. That is, how do you understand this notion of Anglo-Indian? Already this definition of Anglo-Indian has been so historically problematic, because if we look into the Article 366 of the Indian Constitution, we often find that often see that first of all, it is so much patriarchally structured. They say that those who have European fathers and Indian mothers, they are only identified as Anglo-Indians. And if there's Indian fathers and European mothers, they will be treated like the natives, first of all. Secondly, there is another fraction within the Anglo-Indian community which says that we don't accept every European within this group of Anglo-Indian. It is only to be the Irish, the Scottish, and the British. And this is one major reason which I cited in my previous answer, that why the Bow Barracks is even looked down upon by the other Anglo-Indians themselves, or how the community has been otherized by the various flourishing Anglo-Indians who stays in different parts of the city. Do I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Sayan.
Thank you.
I saw Mujib had a comment there. So do you want to maybe elaborate?
Yes, actually, this is a very interesting comment. This is about the burger. Sri Lanka has burger people, though, as a new post-colonial identity group. To be very honest, I don't know much. I mean, I don't know much anything about this burger community. I mean, just to like to, I mean, just drop one comment and one perspective about it, that how this is also a very interracial community. And one interesting thing is there is a lot of similarity between Anglo-Indian musical culture and the burger musical culture. So there has been, so burger is also, as far as I know, is also a kind of interracial community, and they have a lot of musical similarities. Like, for example, if I talk about the concept of the fusion music, the way it has developed in Kolkata especially, actually this concept of this fusion music, that is a fusion in the sense of the Indian and the Western fusion music, it comes from this very root of the Anglo-Indian cultural identities. And also the first group of the jazz and all those music which were introduced in Kolkata, that comes from musicians like Carlton Kitto and several other musicians, Pam Crane and so on and so forth. They were all of the Anglo-Indian descent. So yes, I mean, this Berger comment reminds me of the kind of cultural, the musical identity, the musical lot of similarities which they share with the Anglo-Indian community.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Sayan. Thank you very much.
Are there any other comments or questions to Sayan? Maybe then I have a one that is more related to the research process as such, especially when you talk a lot about, you know, identity and you going, well, basically your positionality. How did you go into the community? How were you accepted? How did you negotiate your own role?
Actually, it's a very interesting question, and initially, I was not very much accepted in the community. So they didn't like my interest. Firstly, because I'm not an Anglo-Indian, so they didn't like my interest that I want to work with them. And for that, I don't want to blame them. There are various reasons behind it. Now, if I give you cite a few reasons, the first of all, if you look into the way the different newspaper articles that exist about this Anglo-Indian community is how they have been exoticized from time to time. So when you find most of the newspaper articles, it talks mostly about how this community celebrates Christmas, how this community celebrates New Year, how this community is a very happy-going community, and so on and so forth. So they are falsely idealized by the media. This is one problem for them. The second problem is the other extreme, that how their crisis, their regular existential crisis, have been misrepresented from time to time. And it has mostly happened with one movie. There was a movie it was, I think, 10 years back, the movie was released. It was named Bo Barracks Forever. The movie was in the Bengali language, but it actually attained quite a global identity because of representing the Anglo-Indians. The Anglo-Indians were completely, the entire community, if you look into the movie, the entire community has been presented in a total negative light. Everybody is alcoholic, everybody is sexually abusive. The women has been portrayed that they leave their husbands every time when they're away and run away with their boyfriends and so on and so forth. So a complete negative gender identity, a complete negative sexual identity. This community is full of drug addicts, they're full of alcohol addicts, they keep on abusing each other, they have no other work, they don't do any constructive work. So all forms of negative elements were portrayed. So as a result, what happened initially, even as an outsider, my first visit was just a casual visit across the community to take photographs. I have been, on several cases, I have been prevented to take photographs of the buildings because they didn't want to do. And the reason they cited is because you people go around and give a negative portrayal of our community across the media. So I obviously knew that just going around the community and talking to people will never help me, and I won't be ever entertained about this. So the second thing I did is there is something called the Bo United Organization, which compiles of old residents and new residents of the Anglo-Indians. There are a lot of earlier residents who were like really flourishing Anglo-Indians at the time of the colonizers, and just immediately after independence they used to stay in Bo Barracks. There are a lot of Anglo-Indians who were original residents of Bo Barracks and they have migrated to different parts of Europe. So they're also part of this Bo United Organization team. They keep on financially contributing. They keep on giving monthly rations to the poor Anglo-Indian residents for their survival and so on and so forth. So it was through the Bo United Organization that my research started moving towards a concrete shape. So it was through the president of the Bo United Organization. I talked to them. I tried to convince them. At the same time, whenever I write an article or whenever I create slides with my points, to ensure that I am not creating any kind of misrepresentation. I take their permission, I share it with them, and take their feedbacks. So this is one aspect, because I remember last year I made a documentary on this only specific Anglo-Indian women of Bow Barracks. So obviously, prior to releasing the documentary and giving it on YouTube, what I did is I obviously showed it to the community members. I spoke with every participant to get an honest feedback if they are being properly represented, they are being stereotyped and misrepresented, because that my purpose is to work with the communities to take them out of this regular stereotypes that they are facing. So I don't want to be again a part of the trap as an individual, as a researcher. So these are some of the things which I usually do with the people.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much.